Hello and welcome to another Science on Top special. Special episodes are just shows that don't follow the regular format, so not a panel discussion. And for this show, we hark back to the 31st of May this year, when we celebrated our 150th episode. We did the show live in front of a great audience at the State Library Victoria, and you can listen to that show at scienceontop.com/150. But before we took the stage, the ever-brilliant Dr. Krystal Evans gave a talk about science in Australia. She talked about how Australia stacks up against the rest of the world, both in scientific accomplishments and in scientific investment. She looked at ways to motivate scientists to engage with the public, and also how to encourage the public to take an interest in science. Can science learn from sport when it comes to fostering interest and inclusion? And when it comes to science, just how much is Australian politics a bit like going on a date with a homeopath? Have a listen and find out. It's a great talk, and we really appreciate Dr. Krystal's time and effort. And of course, I want to thank our MC for the evening, Kobe Smith. Here it is.
Hi. Thanks very much for coming out to the State Library tonight. It's awesome to be here. I am Dr. Krystal Evans. I'm a medical researcher at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute here in Melbourne, and I do work on malaria. During the day, I develop malaria vaccines, and in my spare time, I'm quite interested in science advocacy, and I currently chair the Australian Academy of Sciences Early and Mid-Career Researcher Forum. But tonight, I represent neither of those two groups. I'm here purely as an individual and as a science advocate to talk to you tonight about some of my feelings about the state of Australian science, because I'm really quite passionate about the state of Australian science, and I want to promote science as an Australian ambition, as an essential part of our society, and put science on the national agenda, which is why I was just so pleased when I got an invite to talk here tonight to celebrate the Science on Top podcast, because that's what these guys do every week. They are out there promoting science to Australians and to people all across the world. And I had the privilege of being a guest on the show a couple of times, and it was so much fun, and I just really think you guys do a fantastic job. So congratulations on your 150th show. That kind of could summarise in some ways the current state of Australian science. But who is best placed to judge? And I thought, well, if you're going to talk about the state of science, I mean, what kind of metrics do you use? And as scientists, we tend to judge ourselves and measure ourselves by how many papers we publish, how many times that we put our information out there in prestigious scientific journals, and how many times other people can reference those papers and refer to those papers, and how many grants you write and how much money you get. And I thought these are all kind of quite internal metrics, but you'll be very pleased to know that Australia does quite well when it comes to knowledge creation. There's a statistic that Australia has 0.3% of the world's population, but we publish 3% of the research publications, which is pretty cool. And so there's this idea that Australia punches above their weight. However, it's a bit of a false statistic, because the developing nations, which actually have most of the world's population in Asia and Africa, actually don't do a lot of publishing. So it's a bit of a false statistic, because they're kind of punching below their weight. So of course we would kind of be punching above our weight. And really, is publishing research papers the best way to look at research productivity? It's great if you're a scientist, but when you go to a school and you talk to kids about how great it is to be a scientist, you don't say, I love being a scientist because I get to publish papers. No, you say, I go to schools and I say, I love being a scientist because I get to discover things, because I get to find out stuff that no one's ever found out before, because I want to make a contribution and be the first person to know something that no one else has known before. And so really, scientists who do science themselves genuinely want to make a difference, but it's really hard to measure that. And so when you're going to talk about the state of Australian science, maybe metrics like how many papers we publish aren't actually the most important way of doing that. And so maybe scientists themselves aren't the best judge of the state of Australian science. And maybe it's people like you, the general public, people who have an interest in science, or maybe don't have an interest in science, but you are the ones who kind of are the people for which science is done, for the benefit of humanity. So maybe Australians are the best people to judge the state of Australian science. So what do people in Australia think about science? Everyone in this room seems to be a science fan. And there's a survey that came out just this week from the Australian National University's Centre for the Public Awareness of Science, which basically said, yeah, Australians like science. 82% of Australians said that they listen to or read something to do with science and technology at least every fortnight. And so that means that the majority of Australians are engaging in science. 1 in 2 people were able to name an Australian invention, which I thought was pretty cool because, most people are proud of Australian scientific achievements. They're proud of Wi-Fi, plastic banknotes, the HPV vaccine, the bionic ear, even going back to the stump jump plough. And a very popular hashtag on Twitter recently was thank Cyro for that, for all the things that Cyro has invented and the great products that have been brought to us, things like flexible disposable contact lenses, for example. And there's all fantastic. So 1 in 2 people that you stop on the street can probably name a major Australian invention, which I thought was pretty cool. So scientists are well known in Australia and well respected in Australia. If you have a look at the list of Australians of the Year, they feature prominent Australian scientists like Ian Fraser, Fiona Stanley, Peter Doherty, even Sir Gus Nossal. And do you know who the very first Australian of the Year was? Anybody? The award was started in 1960. It was Sir Macfarlane Burnet, a virologist who had that year won the Nobel Prize. And so from the very inception of our proudest award, the Australian of the Year was a scientist. And scientists often rate highly in polls about who are our most trusted people. And so Australians have a really strong reputation. Australians are engaged in science. It all sounds like the state of Australian science is fantastic. However, public funding for science is in decline. Now, I don't know how you feel about politics, but when you get a new government, things change. We all accept that things change, and so when the new government came in and the cabinet was announced, and I excitedly got the list, and I went through all the cabinet ministers, and I looked for the minister, and I looked, and there was no minister for science, and I was kind of a bit shocked. And a lot of people were. And then we found out that it's okay. We just took it out of the name. So we have a Minister for Industry bracket responsible for science close bracket, which the Prime Minister, tried to explain when he was presenting Prime Minister Tony Abbott explained when he was presenting the Prime Minister's Award for Science this year. He gave a speech and he said, look, titles are not important. And I thought it was quite Shakespearean. It was kind of like a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Perhaps a science minister by any name would grant as much. And Tony Abbott said, judge us by our performance, not by our titles. And we thought, okay, all right, we'll just wait and see what happens. And so then we got to budget night, which for me was a pretty sad night because $420 million worth of funding was cut from science agencies, such as the CSIRO, ANSTO, the ARC, which is the Australian Research Council, the CRC, which is the Cooperative Research Centres, and it was a bit sad, and this is going to, of course, mean job losses. Like 500 people are going to lose their jobs at CSIRO, 500 more. Oh, I see a grumpy cat coming on in the front row. It's pretty sad, the axing of agencies, the potential introduction of fees for undergraduates, including PhD students. It was a pretty harsh budget, but we can't lay all this at the foot of the current government because really science funding has been in decline over the last at least 4 or 5 years. So there's already been a decrease of about $470 million from the science budget over the last 4 years. And in fact, back in 2011, I was out on the front steps of this very building with 5,000 of my closest science friends having a rally to protect medical research funding from cuts in the Labor federal budget. So it's not that it's something that's been happening for quite a while, and it's not something that is particularly partisan. It's the fact that science has really lacked true champions in Parliament in recent years. Though I did hear the Liberal MP Dennis Jensen speaking up for science this week. And I don't know if you heard, but the Liberal backbencher Dennis Jensen has come out and criticised his own party and his own government, saying that they haven't got a coherent science strategy. And sometimes, I don't know about you, but have you ever been on a date when you meet someone, maybe we've met them on the line, which is perfectly acceptable these days, as it turns out. It was far less socially acceptable to meet someone on the internet when I was 17. But hey, you sit down with them and you start chatting, and they like the same movies as you, they like the same music as you, you've got, you like doing the same sort of things, and then they say, yeah, and you say, do you want to go and see a band next weekend? They go, oh, I'm studying for my homeopathy exam. And you sometimes listening to some people who in Parliament talking about science, and they're just like, yes, we need coherent strategies for science. Oh, and especially about climate change, because we need to review the evidence on that. And you sort of think, oh, we were going so well up until that point. But anyway, a lot of scientists have the post-budget blues, and there's been a lot of talk in the media about the brain drain and the end of innovation. And well, I kind of got tired of the phrase brain drain. I don't know about you, but I think that phrase has been around for a really long time. So I asked people on Twitter, do they have any other suggestions? And I got some really good ones. Boffins banished was from one of my friends, Mozzie Bites. Or how about an excellence exodus was from Astro Katie. We got a 3-word budget from Where Is Daz? Stop the brains. And I thought maybe that summed it up. But my favourite one, which probably kind of really summed it up for me in terms of the end of innovation, was hoverboards retracted. But anyway, all of this kind of stuff, it's a bit of a crisis. We're feeling things are really quite down, and it really quite reminded me of a quote from Rahm Emanuel, who said, never allow a good crisis to go to waste. Now, Rahm Emanuel was a former advisor to Barack Obama, and is now currently the mayor of Chicago, and West Wing fans may recognise him in the character of Josh Lyman. And he said, never allow a good crisis to go to waste when it's an opportunity to do things that you had never considered or that you didn't think were possible. And I thought, all right, if we're having a crisis, how can we actually, put this to good use? And really, if there's one upside to all of this stuff that's coming out at the moment about cuts in the science budget, it's that people are actually talking about science. Today, in the Fairfax Press, there was a really quite big article about where science is at, and how Australia really needs a long-term strategic strategy for science. There are people in the media talking about science. There's speeches on budget night. The Treasurer and the Prime Minister were being asked on television about about science, and it's just like people are on TV and everything, and so like that. For once, science is actually seemingly on the edges of the agenda. It might not be there for the reasons we want it to be, but it's there. So how do we capitalise on this kind of post-budget momentum about conversations about science? They've started. How do we continue them? How do we motivate people to want to know more and to engage more? And it kind of reminded me about a study that was done on what motivates employees. Now, this study was one of the Harvard Business Review's breakthrough ideas of 2010, and basically was looking at what is the most significant factor that impacts and increases employee motivation. And you thought, right, well, we'll ask the managers. What do managers think motivates employees? And they had a list of things to choose from, and what the one that came out on top was the managers said that recognition for good work is what motivates employees. That makes sense, you recognise someone's done well, you reward them, you compliment them, you praise them, and so they want to do better because they just want to feel good about themselves. And everyone thought, okay, well, recognition for good work. We'll have a look at that. And so this study was done, and they basically got people at work to keep a diary of how they felt that day, how motivated they felt, and what happened to them that day, and what experiences they had, and how that affected their motivation. And they analysed over 12,000 diary entries. And guess what? Recognition for good work pretty much came out last. It was not what motivated people. And it wasn't what the managers thought motivated their employees at all. In fact, what motivated people was the feeling of progress. The feeling that people had achieved something, that they'd contributed to a bigger picture, that what they had done had made a difference. The fact that they had, at work that day, they'd crossed things off that to-do list. They'd really feel like they'd achieved something, and that's what motivated people to actually do more. And I kind of thought, well, how can we kind of take this study, this science, this evidence base, and apply it to motivating people, to want to know and care and support science. And I guess it's all about the narrative. I mean, when we talk about Australian science, we can talk about our past performance. We can talk about the inventions. We can talk about all the fantastic things that Australians have done, the prizes we've won. And you think, well, that's great, but is past performance actually indicative of future performance? Like, yes, we may have won all these Nobel Prizes, but how do we know we'll win them in the future? And why is that useful? So maybe that's not the best way of going about it. We can talk about the brain drain. We can talk about the fact that people are going to leave, and we can use scare tactics, and we go, well, no hoverboards for you, if you're going to cut science funding, and you think, well, maybe that's not motivating. And what actually might be most motivating is this idea of progress, even incremental progress towards a common goal. And that we should be setting those goals. Like when John F. Kennedy, said that we're going to put a man on the moon. Like, there was something that was aspired to, someone that people wanted to achieve. And there was a feeling of being included, that there was some ownership there. And that feeling of inclusion is probably quite important as well. I mean, in Melbourne, Australians love sport, and people in Melbourne love sport. And I'm not originally from Melbourne. And when I moved here, I thought I just moved into a regular kind of share house with regular kind of normal people, because I moved here in January, right? It's like, everyone was kind of just normal and went about their business. And all of a sudden, it was football season, and they all just turned into absolute rabid sports fans. And they were just like, I'm like, what are you doing this weekend? They said, oh, we're playing away. I said, oh, are you playing? Do you play in a sporting team? They said, oh, no, we're playing in Adelaide. Who's we? I was really confused. And they meant their sporting team. They identified so strongly with their sporting team that they actually spoke about them and included them in their self. They said, well, we're doing this weekend. We're playing at the G. It's like, you play football? No, well, your team does. Okay. And there's this sense of belonging and purpose that, people really have that ownership and inclusion. I thought, well, how can we get people to have more of an ownership and inclusion in science? And some of the most successful recent strategies have been reflected in crowdfunding campaigns. And so I don't know if you're aware of crowdfunding, but it's an idea that if you can put an idea online, and you can say, I want to do this thing, and if you want me to do this thing, you can give me a little bit of money. It doesn't have to be very much. It can be a few dollars here, a few dollars there, But if lots of people want this thing to happen, then you can all put in a bit of money, and then it'll happen. And in fact, in our audience today, we have Dr. Mel Thompson, who is a bit of a champion of...
I'm 1 for 2 so far.
Yeah, don't worry, you're in my notes. Deakin University last year got 6 scientific research projects funded in this way, and Dr. Mel Thompson's project was the Mighty Maggots, which was the use of medical maggots to treat a flesh-eating bacterial disease, and that has been funded. And this year, at the moment, she's got another project going. Here's an ad for you, Mel. A project called Hips for Hipsters, which is a search for new antibiotics to ensure that hip replacements won't become a thing of the past by the time the current hipsters need them. And so it's a way of sourcing small amounts of money, but in return, people feel ownership of the project. And I thought, wow, this is a terrific idea. What if we could build on this? What if we could expand this? Wouldn't it be great if every year, everyone in Australia was actually able to contribute to research? And we could index it some way to make sure it was tied to how much they earn or something. And so that everyone, every year at a set time, could all kind of contribute. And in that way, we could fund science and maybe education and health. And yeah, actually, Australians already do this because we all pay tax. We all crowdfund research in Australia every year, every fortnight when that money comes out of your pay packet. That is the ultimate crowdfunding, is taxation. We already do this. And so just like it's our ABC, maybe we should start thinking about it as our ARC, our Australian Research Council. We need to find a way of opening this up so more people feel engaged. But I'm not saying that the public should be able to sort of vote upon which research is done. I'm not suggesting that we have a reality television show for our NHMRC grants, because I think that could be a disaster. But, in the same way that the public shouldn't be able to directly program the ABC. And while endless loops of Peppa Pig episodes would surely please some parents of small children, we would miss vital news and services and things that are really important for us as a nation. And so in the same way, we want to ensure that science priorities are actually, in the best interest of our nation. And to do that, we really need to start thinking about the ways in which we articulate the kind of Australia we want to live in. You know, science by Australians for Australians, and the way in which we can contribute, and the way in which we can empower other people to actually express what they want to see from science. And it's this level of vision and strategy that is really quite lacking at the moment. We don't have our man on the moon goal. We don't have our idea of what we want to do as a country, what kind of place we want to live in. We've got lots of challenges. We've got lots of challenges around food, agriculture, about extreme climates. We live in one of the most vulnerable, isolated places in the world. We are not short on scientific challenges. It's a matter of being able to articulate those in an overall strategic plan and how we can use our clever scientists and our fantastic resources and our innovative spirit to be able to achieve those. And so Australia is actually only one of 3 countries in the OECD nations without a science and innovation strategy. This was a study, this is from Ian Chubb, the chief scientist, and he actually said that the other 2 countries are Portugal and Luxembourg. So there's over here in the countries with strategic, you know, long-term plans for science is everybody else, and then there's Australia, Portugal and Luxembourg sitting over here in the corner. Now, you know, Portugal, you know, I think their economy is in a much far worse state than ours is. Luxembourg, they've got banking, so they probably don't need science and research. But, you know, Australia's there, and we have so much, and we have done so much without, you know, a plan. I kind of feel like it's a bit like in Star Wars. Like, wouldn't you want to see the power of a fully operational science and research strategy? You know, imagine what we could do. I'm not suggesting we blow planets away, but... So sometimes I feel a bit like the Australian science is a bit like a miracle patient. I feel like, you know, Australian science is kind of hovering on the edge of life support, but never giving in, always coming back, always digging deep, always giving more. And it's remarkable about how much Australian science has achieved under very difficult circumstances. But I really feel that if we focus on the idea of the progress we've made, the progress we're making, and the actual progress that we want to see in the future, that we can take Australia into the 21st century and meet those challenges. And I think part of that is about communicating the science message, which brings me back to why we're here today, which is to celebrate Science on Top, because these guys are out there putting science on the agenda every single week. So congratulations, guys, and I'm looking forward to hearing I'm looking forward to hearing what content you have for us today in your 150th episode, and congratulations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was awesome. Yeah, it worked. That was fantastic. We have time for questions. I'm going to start by saying a couple of things.
Oh, okay. Questions from the MC.
I think that the whole... maybe I'll just do one of those long rambling comments.
So may I remind you that a question is a short statement.
Yes. I will demonstrate by making a statement in the manner in which you shouldn't ask a question, and then I'll follow by a question and you can see the difference. The long rambling statement is that bit where you talked about how people should, you know, scientists shouldn't have to go and be on some Dragon's Den style reality TV show. That was one of the things that I've published from my PhD as an idea. And so I actually think that would be a great idea, and I was meant to ask a question, but I'll just give it as a comment.
Well, I'm not saying I think it's a fantastic way to engage people is to ask them what they want, but I'm not saying that all Australian science should be purely publicly allocated, because science is serendipitous, and so much basic research that doesn't sound like it has any application whatsoever can actually completely change the field. And so if you said to people, hey, is anyone interested in fluorescent jellyfish? Do you think Australians should study that? And everyone will go, no, what would fluorescent jellyfish ever give us? And it turns out that fluorescent jellyfish gave us a green fluorescent protein, which is now one of the most utilised tools in molecular biology and research, to the point where, you know, the people were awarded a Nobel Prize. And so, you know, sometimes the thing that's the most popular aren't necessarily the things that give you the most outcomes. And so whilst I believe there is definitely a place for people to have input into what kinds of research priorities and what sorts of projects they'd like to see, I don't think we should be 100% funded in that way.
That is a great answer, and I also agree.
Well, we're all friends here. Now, who's got another question?
Do any actual legitimate audience members have questions? Oh yeah, a question is, for example, what I just said. Do any audience members have questions? Succinct? Question mark at the end if you were to write it down in a sentence? Hello again. Margaret, right?
Would you care to comment, or do you have a comment on the relationship between the profile of science in the community as a whole and the state of science teaching in our high schools?
I think it starts with education. I think that if you're going to... I think it should start with education. It should start with education, because you want to make sure that if science is to be an integral part of our society, then it has to be there right from the start. And I see no reason why we shouldn't have more science content woven throughout our education system, and that the people who are teaching are trained and confident and qualified and supported to teach science well. And I think this goes throughout, but I think one of the concerns I have about particularly high school science is that it's very much geared towards you do science at high school if and when you need it to go to university. And I feel that there's a general science that's lacking. You can't just do science because you like it or you enjoy it or you're good at it. You only do chemistry if you need to have it at uni. And I feel that that's an area that potentially could, as a low-hanging fruit, that it provides an opportunity to get more science content into our kind of education system. But I'm not a teacher, but I really do feel that you start with primary school, you start with early childhood, and then it moves all the way through the education spectrum, all the way up into undergraduate and postgraduate degrees.
We have another question over here.
Thank you for your talk. That was wonderful. This might be a comment in the form of a question. Just in terms of what you were saying about we need to start with education, does that then, because I know there are a lot of concerns about people being educated into positions that don't exist at the other end, so does it then become a bit of a chicken and an egg thing in that way?
What do you mean by educated into positions that don't exist?
So we begin at high school, engender a love of science, but then they go on to university and there's no industry, nothing for them to go into at the other end.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a false idea that studying science means you have to be a scientist. And I think that the transferable skills and the analytical skills and the depth and breadth of thinking that's required to study science is actually really applicable in many other industries. And I feel that it's and I think this applies at an undergraduate level, but also at a postgraduate level. I mean, in Australia, if you look, for example, in the US, when people graduate from a PhD in science, only 30% of those stay in academic research, 70% of them go on to do other things, and they're valued for doing those other things. And that people with STEM qualifications, science, technology, engineering and mathematics, are actually really highly valued even though they're working out of the area. So people with STEM training in non-STEM jobs actually get quite a lot of recognition for their transferable skills in terms of their in-depth thinking and their ability to be able to synthesize information and problem solve. And I think one of the attractive things about science training is that we're really comfortable with the unknown, and we're really comfortable in coming up with out-of-the-box ways of solving problems, which people who in workplaces may often come across barriers and think, oh well, I don't know how to do that, and so I won't do that. Whereas someone with science training might say, I don't know how to do that, but I'm about to find out how. So I guess that I don't accept the argument that science education is only for scientists.
There were some secret rounds of applause in the audience there, but everyone's feeling very quiet. I just thought that people that are listening at home should know that they liked that answer.
A very quiet golf clap from the third row.
Are there any other questions?
It's okay if there isn't. But if anyone wants to know for future reference, I have an excellent definition of a question here. A question is a relatively short set of words ending in a question mark capable of being answered from the stage. If you feel the urge to tell us what you think about something, that's not a question. And that was a direct quote from Neil Gaiman when he was here giving a talk in Melbourne, actually, and I was in the audience, and I felt that was really quite appropriate.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to use that again.
I need to memorise it for situations such as these. Anyway, I think that that we're going to have a break.
That is correct. Yes. Would you like to become the MC?
No, but I'd really like a break.
Okay. It just so happens. Let's first of all give Dr. Krystal a big round of applause.